There is something about the pyramids of Egypt that makes people refuse to believe the obvious answer. They are so vast, so precise, so impossibly old, that for centuries human beings have looked at them and decided that ordinary people could not possibly have built them. And so the theories multiply. Armies of whip-driven slaves dying by the thousands under the desert sun. A lost civilization of forgotten geniuses, wiped from history. Visitors from other worlds dropping their technology into the Nile Valley. Anything, it seems, rather than the plain truth. Because the plain truth feels too small for something so enormous. Here's what makes this one of the great ironies in all of history. We actually know who built the pyramids. No guesses. Not theorize. No. Over the last few decades, archaeologists digging in the sand right beside the Great Pyramid have uncovered the builders themselves, their town, their bakeries, their bones, their tombs, and even the written logbook of a man who helped haul the stone. The answer is no longer a mystery. It has a face, a diet, a daily schedule, and a name. And that answer is more surprising than any of the myths. The people who raised the pyramids were not slaves. They were not aliens. They were not the survivors of Atlantis. They were Egyptians, skilled, organized, extraordinarily well cared for. And when they died, buried with honor in the shadow of the very monuments they had built. Some were full-time master craftsmen. Many more were ordinary farmers who came to serve on the greatest project their nation had ever attempted, and went home again. So the title of this story cuts two ways, and both matter. There is what the public gets wrong: the slaves, the aliens, the whole culture of disbelief. But there is also a harder truth, which is that for a very long time, even the experts got the central fact wrong. Following an ancient rumor, generations of scholars simply assumed the pyramids were the work of forced, enslaved labor. It took a set of astonishing discoveries, some of them within living memory, to overturn that assumption and replace it with something the evidence actually supports. This is the story of how we finally learned the truth about how a tourist's stumbling horse, a buried city, a cemetery of honored workers, and the oldest papyrus on Earth combined to answer a question people had been arguing about for 2,000 years. And it's the story of why the real builders deserve so much better than the myths we keep putting in their place. Because to insist that humans couldn't have built the pyramids isn't a compliment to the mystery. It's an insult to the people who actually did it. And those people left us their receipts. The first thing we have to do is understand where the biggest lie came from, the one about the slaves. Ask most people how the pyramids were built, and the image that appears is almost cinematic. Thousands of slaves straining at ropes under the crack of a whip, a cruel overseer, a pharaoh watching from a golden chair. It is one of the most durable pictures in popular history, and it is wrong, but it did not come from nowhere. The single biggest source is a Greek historian named Herodotus. He wrote about the Great Pyramid and claimed it had been built by vast gangs of 100,000 laborers, toiling in misery for decades. For centuries, his account was treated as the definitive word on the subject. But there is an enormous problem hiding in the dates. Herodotus visited Egypt around the 5th century before Christ. The Great Pyramid had already been standing for roughly 2,000 years before he ever laid eyes on it. There is a delicious irony buried in his account, too. Even Herodotus did not quite describe the whip-driven slave gangs of the movies. He wrote of 100,000 men working in relays, in shifts of 3 months at a time, which, if you squint, sounds far more like a rotating national labor force than a permanent army of chained captives. The popular imagination took his big, dramatic numbers and quietly dropped the detail that even he described the work as something done in turns by men who then went home. Let that sink in. Herodotus was not a witness. He was further removed in time from the building of the Great Pyramid than we are today from the fall of the Roman Empire. He was a foreign traveller, collecting stories from local guides 2 millennia after the fact, writing them down in a language not his own, about events no living person had seen. Whatever he was told, it had passed through 20 centuries of rumour and legend before it reached his ear. As a record of how the pyramids were actually built, it is almost worthless, and yet it shaped the world's imagination for the next 2,000 years. Then a second, even more powerful current fed into the myth. Somewhere along the way, the pyramids got tangled up with the biblical story of the Hebrews enslaved in Egypt, the Exodus, the bondage, the cruel Pharaoh of Sunday school lessons and Hollywood epics. In the popular mind, the two fused. Hebrew slaves, it was assumed, must have been the ones building those giant tombs. It made for unforgettable cinema. It is also, historically, a mess. The pyramids of Giza were built more than 1,000 years before the period the Exodus story would even describe. Whatever one believes about that story, the Great Pyramids were ancient history long before it. The connection is a collision of two entirely different eras, welded together by legend. Stir it all together a garbled Greek rumour, a biblical story from a different millennium, medieval retellings, and a century of movies, and you get the slave myth, a false memory so vivid and so often repeated that it came to feel like simple, common sense. And here is the uncomfortable part for the experts. For a long time, Egyptology itself largely went along with it. Lacking better evidence, scholars broadly accepted that the pyramids had been built by some form of forced or enslaved labour. It was the default assumption, printed in textbooks, repeated with confidence. This is the piece the title points at. It was not only the public that got the builders wrong. The field did too until, beginning in a very specific year, the sand beside the pyramids started giving up a completely different story, and the experts had to change their minds. That change began, of all ways, with a tourist falling off a horse. In 1990, a tourist was riding a horse across the desert near the Giza pyramids when the animal stumbled, its hoof breaking through the surface into a hidden wall of mud brick just below. That accidental stumble led archaeologists to one of the most important discoveries in the history of Egyptology: the lost world of the people who built the pyramids. What they found, and went on excavating through the following years, were two things that together demolished the slave myth. The first was a cemetery, the graves of the pyramid workers themselves. Hundreds of ordinary workers' graves, and dozens of larger, finer tombs for the overseers and skilled craftsmen who ran the project. The second was an entire town, a purpose-built settlement beside the pyramids where the workforce lived, ate, and slept. Start with the cemetery, because it is the single most powerful piece of evidence there is. These workers were given real burials. They were laid to rest, with grave goods and funerary offerings, in proper tombs, according to Egyptian religious custom, and they were buried right next to the pyramids of their kings, in the most sacred ground in the country. This is not how you treat slaves. Slaves are disposable. You do not give a slave an eternal resting place beside the God-King, equipped for the afterlife. The very location and dignity of these graves screams that these people were honored. They were proud of their work, proud enough to want to spend eternity beside it, and the state thought them worthy of that honor. Then there is the town, and it tells the same story from another angle: the archaeology of food. The settlement contained bakeries and breweries operating on an industrial scale, and the rubbish heaps of the workers' meals. When archaeologists sifted through what these people actually ate, they found bread, fish, and, strikingly, enormous quantities of meat and the bones of cattle, sheep, and goats. Great herds were being driven in from across Egypt to feed the workforce. The settlement was so large and so complete that the archaeologist who spent decades excavating it nicknamed it the Lost City of the Pyramids. It had long galleries that likely served as barracks or dormitories, storerooms, workshops, administrative buildings, and those industrial-scale kitchens, a planned company town built by the state to house and provision the people raising the monuments. And the workers left their signatures in the most unexpected place of all. High up inside the Great Pyramid itself, in cramped hidden chambers above the burial room that were never meant for human eyes, explorers found gang graffiti daubed in red paint, including the name of a work crew that proudly called itself something like the Friends of Khufu, the very king whose tomb they were sealing. The men who built the greatest structure on Earth wrote their team's name inside it, in a place only they would ever see. By the standards of the ancient world, these laborers were eating extremely well, quite possibly better than they had ever eaten back home in their own villages. You do not feed slaves prime beef. You feed prime beef to workers you value and want to keep strong. The bones of the workers themselves added the final human detail. Their skeletons show the marks of genuinely hard physical labor: worn joints, strained backs, the toll of moving heavy stone. But they show something else too: healing. Archaeologists found bones that had been broken and then set and mended. They even found evidence of workers surviving serious injuries, and in some cases, surgery, and living on for years afterward. Someone was caring for the injured. Someone was setting their fractures and letting them recover. A slave who broke his leg was a slave you discarded. Those people were treated by what amounted to a medical system and nursed back to health. Put it together: honored burials in sacred ground, a diet of bread, beer, and beef, and broken bones lovingly healed. Every strand of the evidence pointed the same way, and it pointed directly against 2,000 years of assumption. Whoever built the pyramids, they were not a mass of expendable slaves. They were a valued, cared for, and honored workforce. Which raises the obvious next question. If they weren't slaves, who exactly were they? And how did a kingdom organize tens of thousands of people to move mountains of stone? The answer that has emerged is, in a way, more impressive than any slave army could ever be. The pyramids were built by a whole society organizing itself, on a scale and with a sophistication that is genuinely staggering for its age. At the heart of the operation was a core of permanent, full-time professionals: master masons, engineers, architects, sculptors, and skilled crews who worked on the royal projects year-round and lived in the town beside the pyramids. These were the experts, the people who knew how to cut, move, and place stone with breathtaking precision, and who passed their craft down through generations. and the total workforce was far smaller than the myth insists. Herodotus imagined 100,000 men. Modern estimates, based on the size of the town and the logistics of feeding it, put the number closer to 20 or 30,000 at the peak. Still a vast undertaking, but a manageable, organized one, not a heaving ocean of humanity. The crews were subdivided into smaller named units, a tidy chain of teams within teams, the way any large organization breaks its people into manageable groups. One of the deep mysteries used to be how they moved the colossal blocks at all. And here, too, the Egyptians left us the answer in their own art. A surviving ancient painting shows a huge statue being dragged on a wooden sledge by rows of men. And standing on the front of the sledge, one worker pours water onto the sand in the path ahead. Wetting the sand in just the right way dramatically reduces the friction, letting a sledge glide where it would otherwise plough and stick. No magic, no anti-gravity, just water, rope, timber, and a clever understanding of their own desert. But the great mass of muscle came from somewhere else, and this is the key to the whole system. Most of the workforce were ordinary Egyptians farmers who came to serve in rotating shifts. And the timing was dictated by the river. Every year the Nile flooded, spreading across the farmland and making agriculture impossible for a stretch of months. During that season, a huge population of farmers had nothing to plant and nothing to harvest. Their fields were underwater, and it was precisely then that they came to work on the pyramids. Think about the elegance of that. The one time of year when the labor force was idle was the one time of year the state needed enormous numbers of hands. So the flood that drowned the fields freed the workers, and the kingdom channeled that seasonal army into building for the gods and the king. It was most likely a form of national service, a labor duty owed to the state, of a kind common in the ancient world, and in return the workers were housed, fed, and provided for. They served their rotation, and then they went home to their farms when the waters fell and the planting season returned. These were not anonymous, broken-spirited captives. They organized themselves into work gangs with names proud, boastful names, sometimes invoking the king himself. Names that translate to things like the friends of a pharaoh or the drunkards of a pharaoh. And they left those names behind. Deep inside the monuments, in spots never meant to be seen, workers scrawled their gang markings in red ochre graffiti, tallying the crews and the days they worked. They were signing their labor. They wanted it known that their team had been here and done this. That is the mark of people with pride in their work, not the desperation of the enslaved. And then, in 2013, came the discovery that turned all of this from a strong inference into something you can practically read over a builder's shoulder. On the Red Sea coast, at an ancient harbour, a French archaeological team found a set of papyri sealed in caves, and they turned out to be the oldest written papyri ever discovered anywhere on Earth. Among them was a logbook. It had been written some 45 centuries ago by an official named Merer. Merer was an inspector, a team leader in charge of a crew of around 200 men. And his diary records, day by day, what his team was doing. Hauling boatloads of fine white limestone from the quarries at Tura, downriver and along the canals, to the great building site at Giza, stone almost certainly destined to case the outside of the Great Pyramid of Khufu itself. Here, in a working man's own handwriting, from the very reign of the king whose pyramid still dominates the skyline, is a first-hand account of the construction, not written by slaves in chains, written by an organized, literate, salaried official, logging the logistics of the greatest building project of the ancient world, the ancient equivalent of a foreman's shipping records. The builders didn't just leave their bones and their town, they left their paperwork, and Mera's account fits the ground perfectly. He describes delivering his limestone by water, right to the pyramid site, and archaeologists at Giza have since traced the remains of a long-vanished harbour and a network of canals that once brought boats from the Nile up to the very foot of the plateau. Mera wrote that he floated stone to the edge of the Great Pyramid. The excavators found the waterway that let him do it. A 45-century-old diary and the modern dig confirm each other, detail for detail. That is what real evidence looks like. Not a single dramatic secret, but 100 ordinary facts from 100 sources, all quietly pointing at the same human answer. So that handles the slaves. But there is a second, stranger form of disbelief that has to be answered directly, the one that says, no human hands built these things at all, that the precision is too perfect, the stones too heavy, the achievement too great for Bronze Age Egyptians, and that therefore the answer must lie with a lost super-civilization or with visitors from the stars. The honest, evidence-based reply to that is simple. There is not a single piece of physical evidence for it, and there is a mountain of evidence against it. Because the Egyptians did not spring a perfect pyramid on the world out of nowhere. They learned how to build them, in public, by trial and error, over generations, and we can watch them do it. Look at the sequence. The first large pyramid, the step pyramid, is essentially a stack of shrinking platforms, a brilliant first attempt that still looks like what it was, an experiment in piling stone high. Later, kings pushed further and tried to build a true smooth-sided pyramid and stumbled. One early attempt at Maidum appears to have partially collapsed, its outer casing sliding away into a heap of rubble that still surrounds it. Another, the famous bent pyramid, changes its angle sharply part-way up. The builders started too steep, evidently realized mid-construction that it was unstable, and had to reduce the slope on the fly to keep the whole thing from failing. Only after those costly lessons did the same king's builders finally get it right, raising the first true smooth pyramid, and only then, with all that hard-won knowledge, did the next generation build the Great Pyramid at Giza. That progression is the death of the alien theory. Beings with godlike technology do not need practice runs. They do not build a lopsided experiment, watch it collapse, botch the angle on the next one, and slowly work their way up to competence over a century of mistakes. That messy, fumbling, improving sequence is the unmistakable fingerprint of human beings learning a hard skill the hard way. The failures are the proof, and the physical trail of human work is everywhere, if you simply look. We have the quarries where the stone was cut, still bearing the marks of copper tools, and the scars where blocks were pried loose. We have quarry sites with a giant unfinished obelisk still lying in the bedrock, abandoned when it cracked a work site, frozen mid-task. We have the remains of the construction ramps, the tools, the copper chisels, the wooden sledges, and the traces of the water the Egyptians poured onto the sand to make dragging heavy stone easier. We have the boats and the harbours, and the canals that moved the stone. We have the workers' town, the workers' graves, the gang graffiti, and Mera's logbook. Every step of the process has left a human residue in the earth. What we do not have anywhere at all is a single artifact, tool, or trace that could not have been made by the people we know were living right there and doing exactly this work. So here is the truth the myths keep trying to bury. The pyramids were built by ancient Egyptians, by a permanent core of brilliant craftsmen and a rotating tide of ordinary farmers, fed on bread and beef, cared for when they were hurt, organized into proud-named gangs, directed by literate inspectors like Merer, and honored with sacred burials when they died. It took no sloves and no sources. It took a whole civilization at the height of its confidence, choosing to pour its people and its wealth into touching the sky. That is what the disbelievers get wrong. In every version, they think they are protecting a great mystery. What they are actually doing is robbing real people of the most astonishing thing human beings had ever built and handing the credit to whips or to gods or to aliens because they cannot bring themselves to believe the far more remarkable answer, that it was us, ordinary, mortal, ingenious us. And the builders left their names in red ochre on the stone to make sure we would never quite be able to forget it.